Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version of the Spanish speaking radio show I do weekly. This is your host, Gabriel Andrade from Maracaibo, Venezuela. And joining me on the other end of the line is Professor John Leslie from Victoria Island in Canada. Professor Leslie is the author of the book, The End of the World, and we're going to be talking about this topic today. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Welcome, too.
The End of the World is a most interesting book. Over there you outline some of the scenarios for the end of our species, and you discuss events such as a nuclear war and pandemics and asteroids and volcanoes. But you also discuss the so-called doomsday argument. This is a philosophical argument to make us think that perhaps we are closer to the end of the world than what we usually think. How does that argument go?
The argument looks at the fact that if we survived a few more centuries, it's quite likely we'd be able to colonize the entire galaxy, and there would then be vastly many humans, not just billions of humans, but trillions of humans. And if we instead went extinct soon, then there'd be obviously far fewer humans. In the case of colonizing the galaxy, we would be among the very most early humans ever, as counted by a clock which ticks every time that a human is born. If we go extinct soon, then we're maybe in the 10% class. About 1 in 10 humans is alive today. And there's a general principle of science and of probability theory which says that you should generally try to look on yourself as in a larger class rather than in a smaller class. And if we try looking at ourselves as in a larger class, we find that the best way of getting into the larger class is to say that humans in the future just won't exist.
Right.
And we'll be quite normal people in the 1 in 10, not in the 1 in a trillion.
Right. So are you saying that regardless of what the scenarios are actually like, this probabilistic thinking should lead us to the conclusion that we're in the last stages?
No, it doesn't work like that. It is only probabilistic thinking, and it has to take into account all sorts of facts. If we were very confident that the human race was going to survive, then this probabilistic reasoning would make our feeling of risk, it would magnify it, but we could still remain very confident at the end of the magnification. If you magnify a very, very small risk, then you can still end up with only a small risk. So certainly we have to look at the particular dangers, and we also have to look at the particular ways in which we're trying to counter those dangers. For example, by putting in treaties which prevent people developing biological warfare.
Right. Now, I can think of a few objections that some other philosophers have raised to this argument. I'm going to name a few, and if you can, please respond to them. One of the most obvious ones is that anybody at any point in history can develop this argument, and he can come to the conclusion that the end of the world is close. So let's say that someone during Roman times could have used that same thinking, and he would have said, well, I mean, we're among the 10% of all human beings that have ever lived, so that must mean that the end is close. And yet, that Roman person would have been mistaken, because here we are 2,000 years later, and the world has not come to an end. So how do you respond to that objection?
Well, it's a very interesting objection. But you can say on the one hand that we have all sorts of dangers around these days which weren't around in Roman times. And on the other hand, you can say, well, the person in Roman times has just been in a very unusual situation, and some people really are always in very unusual situations. But that doesn't mean to think that we should. It doesn't mean that we should conclude that we are in a very unusual situation. Somebody is going to be in the unusual situation of winning a lottery, if it's a very large lottery. But it's always better to think that the lottery has only a few tickets. A few tickets sold if you win.
But how do you make sure that our generation is indeed the one that is at the most risk? I mean, I can see your point about we being among the 10% of all humanity that's ever lived. But I mean, couldn't we make the same argument if we lived in 1,000 years from now?
Well, yes, that's true. But the argument is saying that we are not likely to live in 1,000 years from now. That's how it goes.
Well, but isn't that a circular argument?
I don't think so. I think it's just saying that if you have a situation in which population is expanding very greatly, then you should think that the expansion is likely to come to an end during your lifetime. It's like the case of being in a Ponzi scheme. If more and more people pull into the Ponzi scheme, which generation of people in the Ponzi scheme are you likely to be in? You're likely to be in the latest one. The Ponzi scheme is like the one run by Bernie Madoff for very many dollars. I think it was billions of dollars, where you keep on bringing new investors into your company by promising them tremendous returns, and you give them their returns by putting in more new investors. Sooner or later, the whole thing is going to collapse, and you should not invest in a scheme like this. You should think you're in at the end of the process.
Of course. Now, let's say that the fertility rate for humanity goes down in the next 5 centuries, and by the year 2500, the world population is cut by half, as it's actually the case in some Western European countries where fertility rate is going down. Now, in that case, by the year 2500, that generation would not be among the 10% of all humans that ever lived, but let's say 5%. Would that reduce the risk of the doomsday argument? Because in that case, we would no longer be among the 10%, but rather among the 5%.
Yes, indeed it would. If population declines, then you can think yourself in just that more normal situation. The main thing is that you should try to avoid seeing yourself as in a very, very unusual situation. But it's not clear on the one hand that population is going to decline. I think people are saying that at the end of the century there may be as many as 12 billion people around. And on the other hand, who knows that the human race is going to last that long?
Right.
We may manage to extinguish ourselves before that because, for example, of germ warfare, which I think is probably the most dangerous risk on the immediate horizon.
Right. Now, there's another objection that I want to point out here that I don't think you address in your book, but some philosophers have raised it, which is, how do you count the first human? I mean, evolution theory tells us that there are no jumps in species, so to speak. That, I mean, from our ancestors to the current species Homo sapiens, there is a very smooth transition. So, I mean, how do you begin to count how many humans have ever lived if you're not sure who was the first human?
You can't count very accurately, but in fact it turns out that it doesn't much matter, because the beginnings of humanity there were very few people. So whether you go back 100,000 years, 500,000 years, it doesn't really make much difference to how many people there were in that period. The answer always is very few.
Right. Now, one other thing that I really got my attention from your book is the part on ethics. Now, you say then we have an obligation to try to preserve the species and the planet for our future generations. And you try to face some of the objections that other philosophers have raised when they say that it's not really our obligation, and that we shouldn't really care about this issue all that much. Why should we care?
Well, there's two ways of approaching ethics. One of them says ethics is just a way of reducing conflicts between people. And if there aren't any people, there aren't going to be any conflicts. And therefore there's nothing wrong in humanity coming to an end.
Yes.
That's one way. The other way, it says, let's try to produce as much human happiness as possible, and that involves not just making individual humans happier, but trying to get as many happy people into the world as possible. I think one way of looking at this is to see that we have a very strong duty not to keep on producing humans if it was guaranteed that they'd all be unhappy. There we'd definitely count numbers of unhappy humans. We'd say, because there would be a trillion humans or whatever if we managed to colonize the galaxy, and they'd all be unhappy, this would be a terrible thing to do.
Right.
And I think my way of thinking just flips that around. If there were sufficiently many happy humans, we could produce them, that would be an excellent thing to do. So let's try to colonize the galaxy and make human lives exist in large numbers.
Right.
I hope that makes sense.
Yes, of course, it makes sense. The thing is that, I mean, that you're basically, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand you, you're approaching a utilitarian view of ethics, of saying that we have to maximize well-being as much as possible, both qualitatively and quantitatively. Am I right?
Yes, I've always found it very paradoxical that some people think it's the right thing to do things which will lead to less good. I think it's always right to do things which will lead to more good.
Right. And what are, I mean, you outlined the dangers in your book, but you already say that germ warfare is probably the most dangerous. What other dangers really concern you, and what can we do about it?
Well, I'm concerned with the danger of a runaway greenhouse effect, where you get feedback loops which mean that warming always producing more warming. That is sometimes discussed by climate theorists, but they tend not to influence people like the International Panel on Climate Change, because these risks are at the margin. They don't seem very great yet. But I still think that should be looked at. I also think people should look at the danger that computers will replace humans. They're getting more and more intelligent, and it might be that in the next 50 years we'll have humans not being able to compete in intelligence with computers. And the computers might want to take over the world, and some people think that would be a good idea. I think it would be a very bad idea. And then I also look at the danger of high-energy experiments. At the moment, the accelerated experiments aren't dangerous, as far as I can see, but some scientists are looking very carefully at what will the dangers be if we make the accelerated experiments many thousand times more powerful. It could be that we would upset a field which is filling the universe at the moment, and we could upset it in a disastrous way, in which case we'd destroy Earth in a fraction of a second, and then after 100,000 years, the galaxy would have disappeared.
I want to go back real quick to the scenario of the machines rebelling against us. Now, most of our listeners will be thinking that this is just too close to science fiction. I mean, it's good for entertainment, but it strikes them as unlikely that such a thing would ever happen. I mean, what would have to happen in order for machines to rebel against us? I mean, wouldn't we be in control of the machines if we designed them from the beginning?
I think that one of the main problems here is that the way to push up machine intelligence very quickly is to have machines design themselves. And there are, in fact, the beginnings these days of having machines improve their own computer programs. It might be possible to put in safeguards at the start, but if you have very, very intelligent machines, they could work around their own safeguards if they are able to do their own design. When you talk of science fiction, you have to remember that as little as 30, 40 years ago, it just seemed science fiction that any computer would be able to beat a good club chess player. And these days, the computers are more expert than the world chess masters. They can easily beat the world chess masters at chess. So what seems science fiction today may not seem at all like science fiction tomorrow.
Right, indeed. But what about if we implement Isaac Asimov's famous laws of robotics, and from the beginning we make sure that, as one of those laws says, that no robot can ever harm a human being. I mean, beating someone in a game of chess is not really harming someone; it's just outdoing them, but it's not really prejudicial. That's a different matter.
Yeah, it would be very important to try to implement that law of robotics. But if you have a machine which is able to do its own programming, it might be able to get around that. The other problem is that the machine might look at the fact that we shouldn't harm humans, and it might think like the philosopher Schopenhauer, who thought that by producing more and more humans, you're producing more and more harm. Schopenhauer thought that practically everybody was more miserable than happy, and that this was inevitable. And his view would be that it would be a good thing to extinguish all human beings, that we're helping them, not harming them.
So, do you think he would have been in favor of the end of the world?
I'm sure Schopenhauer, he said it would be better that the Earth had been like the Moon, a lifeless mass. That's what he actually wrote. And you then ask yourself why he didn't commit suicide.
Right.
The answer is that he thought he'd be reincarnated.
Yes, of course. Well, Schopenhauer, he had great Oriental influences, right?
Yeah.
Right, indeed. Now, do you see any possibility that the human species, if it survives long enough and it colonizes the galaxy and so on, it will evolve into yet another species?
I see that, and I see its possible importance for the doomsday argument. The doomsday argument only applies to humans, and it just depends on what you count as humans. If you say that if humans in the future evolved an extra arm, for example, or became 100 times more intelligent, then they shouldn't count as humans, then you might not be worried by the doomsday argument if you thought that the humans are going to go extinct, but those human descendants are going to continue onwards. It just depends what you want in the future. The doomsday argument is it is not itself concerned with exactly how you define human. It allows you to define human precisely as you like, and then it will draw its conclusions on the basis of that.
Right. Why should we count the number of humans that have ever lived and not count, let's say, the number of years that the human species has been around? Because if we take the criterion of the number of humans that ever lived, then yes, obviously the doomsday argument makes sense. But if we take the number of years, well, the human species has been, let's say, 200,000 years. And if we think we're not exceptional, then we at least should have 200,000 years more. So why take that criterion and not the other?
We take the criterion of number of humans because if you wanted to guess where you stood in the human race, and there was a fact of the matter, if you were in a deterministic universe, then you could run a very simple argument that your chances of being the last 5% of humans is 5%. Your chances of being the first 5% is 5%. And your chances of being in the middle is the remainder, 90%. You can run this argument, and it obviously has to be run by a number of humans, not just how long. that's if you want to win bets in this area.
Right. Now, personally, what's your diagnosis? How long do we have?
Well, I myself think that it's quite probable we'll get through the next 500 years, or maybe something like 60%. And I also think that once we've done that, we have a chance of getting through the galaxy, but not more than about 40%. And any chance above 50%, you find that the doomsday argument gets very, very strong against you. It's very unlikely that humans will manage to colonize a very large number of galaxies, and it's the chances of the colonizing the galaxy, I'd say, almost certainly can't be over 50%.
So in the short term, you're optimistic, but let's say that in the long term, you're not as optimistic about our future prospects.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic than, for example, Lord Martin Rees, who's one of Great Britain's most famous scientists. He got his professorship at Cambridge in astronomy in his early 30s, and he became the Astronomer Royal, and in due course Sir Martin Rees and Lord Rees. He published a book called Our Final Century, and he there said that he thought that the human race had only a half chance of getting through the next century. Well, we've already got several years into the century since Martin published that book. So there are very eminent scientists who are a lot more worried than I am.
Right. Now, does this have any implication on religion? I mean, if there is a God, would he allow us to become extinct? If we become extinct, what would God do?
I have interests in this question. I think it would be very unwise to put reliance on God. If you remember, there was a famous saying by Oliver Cromwell, who was a military leader who believed in God. He said, trust in God, but keep your powder dry. Don't get rain stop you from firing your guns.
Right.
You have to assume that God has allowed disasters in the past. God could allow the disaster of the human race going extinct. After all, God is meant to be with the part who creates another intelligent race to replace it.
Right.
That's how I would tend to argue here.
All right. Professor John Leslie, thank you so much for taking our call.
Thank you for interviewing me.
Indeed.